Welcome to The Rally. This podcast includes commentary and conversations about issues relevant to clinical psychology. It is intended to educate, entertain, and enlighten, and is not a substitute for actual mental health treatment. Individuals who share personally here choose willingly to tell their stories to benefit you, the listener. All other references to clinical situations are altered or limited to protect confidentiality. For more specific questions or help with a personal situation, please consult a local mental health professional. Therapy, mental health, real life. This is Psych Rally with Los Angeles-based clinical psychologist Dr. Martin Hsia.
All right, welcome all, wherever and whenever you are tuning in from. This is Psych Rally, Episode 5, brought to you by TZK Seminars. Live webinars and home study videos for psychologists, social workers, and licensed counselors. For the lowest price for live continuing education in the industry, go to tzkseminars.com. So I'm going to go on a little monologue here before I bring in my friend Hsia today, because one of the things that I feel very strongly about and I'm very interested in is sort of a rift in my field of clinical psychology and psychotherapy specifically. And that is the differences between various schools of thought and approaches to therapy. And I'm talking specifically about the world of psychoanalysis, theory, approach, and its practitioners, psychoanalysts. And on the other side, the world of cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. And like all things, there's certainly a spectrum. Most of my colleagues, even if they identify more with or practice from one or the other of those two angles, certainly have an appreciation for the other perspective, not a one or the other mentality. But just like in politics and many other things, there are certainly folks who are pretty extreme and outspoken on one end or the other. So to give kind of a brief or maybe probably an oversimplified background, if you're new to this, psychoanalysis, I'm not going to go into a detailed history lesson here, but everybody knows Freud, and his early followers. There were certainly various divisions within psychoanalysis and its early thinkers, the Kleinians and the British school, and then prior to being ported into the U.S. There have certainly been some very heated divisions within psychoanalysis and very much evolution in psychoanalytic thinking over time. But typically what's unifying within psychoanalysis is an emphasis on understanding behavior and pathology through a developmental lens, or as I think you could say, influenced by early childhood experiences. And the therapeutic approach is that, what follows is that there's an emphasis on the relationship between patient and therapist, or as analysts would say, between the analyst and the analysand. And what happens there in terms of what is said or felt and how it's said and what's not said and how that's worked on within the relationship, that's the main vehicle for insight and change. And, the tradition in psychoanalysis is for the process to be longer and kind of organic as things come up. And certainly there's a tradition of meeting multiple times a week, sometimes 3 to 4 times per week. There's also a tradition of a deep appreciation for the unconscious, and that early needs, conflicts, urges can be expressed in adult psychoanalysis in symbolic or nonverbal ways, dreams, Freudian slips, etc. And helping people talk out those issues that they may not be aware of is what psychoanalysis can do, rather than having people continue to act them out in some sort of destructive or repetitive way. By contrast, cognitive behavior therapy tends to be more of a directive approach, takes things more at face value. Let's identify errors in how you're thinking or interpreting a certain situation, find a different way to think or an attitude that's more functional, and in turn, reduce problematic behaviors, actions, or symptoms of anxiety or depression. The cognitive behavior therapy world emphasizes what they call homework. It could be specific tasks, exercises, exposures, writing assignments, things that keep the process of therapy going in between meetings with the therapist. CBT is typically thought of as more of a present-focused and perhaps more targeted approach toward a specific problem or symptom, such as OCD, a phobia, even health conditions, irritable bowel syndrome, for example, and in turn, it's designed to be more time limited, shorter term. So it's generally not as exploratory as the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic schools, if you will. So here are a couple of arguments on both sides. First, let's talk about some common criticisms of cognitive behavior therapy. One is that it's too simplistic, too surface level. People, there's an argument that you can change certain thoughts and behaviors, but it's not going to be effective in creating lasting change because it's not really getting to the root of the problem or going far back enough into someone's history. Another criticism is that you'll see these workbooks and manuals for curing depression in 12 weeks, or 10 weeks of cognitive behavior therapy to cure panic attacks. But the criticism is that, hey, we're not robots. We're human beings. We're not software programs, and you can't make dealing with an emotional or psychological issue into a linear or manualized process. And that's a flawed and even dangerous view of a person. And another common criticism of CBT is that there's just not enough emphasis on the relationship. That it's too simplistic to have just you be a teacher and facilitating something for someone. It's a human one-to-one interaction, and that's really where the power is. So let's go back on and there's some common criticisms about, on the other side, psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic practice. A common one is that it's impractical. It takes too long. Some people say it's not focused or goal-oriented, and thus, for a lot of people, it's not affordable. And maybe it doesn't seem worth the investment if they're not getting concrete suggestions or some strategies from their therapist for dealing with their symptoms. Another criticism you'll hear is that some people just don't like the assumption that all of their problems are based on childhood experiences. There's the folks who say, stop suggesting that it's my parents' fault. They were pretty darn good parents. I just feel depressed because of something I'm dealing with here and now as an adult. So help me cope with the present in the present. There are plenty more criticisms on each side, but this is just a starting point. And I assume we'll come back to this in other episodes of this podcast, but this is just a starting point from which I will say, in many ways, I think those points are valid. I think there's some validity on both ends to some extent. And by the way, even though I work in a setting that identifies explicitly as a cognitive behavior therapy practice, and much of what we do certainly is CBT, for me that doesn't preclude me from being critical of CBT and deciding how best to serve my client at any given moment, regardless of what school of thought or approach I'm drawing from. I think all the schools of thought and techniques exist for good reason, and I'm more interested in what's good and helpful in each of those than determining who's absolutely right and who's wrong. But let me tell you a little more about my evolution on this issue throughout graduate training and into this point in my career, because there certainly has been an evolution. There's this argument that cognitive behavior therapy is for therapists who are inexperienced or maybe are impatient with the process of change and can't tolerate ambiguity, and or need a recipe or instruction manual to follow in terms of how to help someone with a specific issue or symptom. And that may be the case for some people out there. But at least for myself, it was actually very much the opposite. Cognitive behavior therapy was something that I came upon later on in my professional development. I was really raised early on in my years of graduate training on a diet of object relations. And I would say somewhere on the border of traditional and contemporary psychoanalytic thinking. In fact, I was taught to be very skeptical of CBT, to sort of shrug it off as suggesting a reductionist or formulaic view of the human mind. The emphasis was on the therapy relationship and who I was in a secure base role to my client, just as a caregiver to an infant. Now, somewhere inside of me, I've always been skeptical of the either-or dichotomous view of the debate. I don't think I could easily accept that a whole entire school of thought with countless proponents and studies to show its efficacy was just flat-out bunk or harmful even, as was often the implication. I think I was really just coming from a place of I want to be as effective as a therapist as I can be, and if CBT has anything that I can learn from that will help me in helping people, I want to cross the aisle and see what's over there too. So I actually remember in my graduate coursework, there was, for my advanced electives, I was in some ways all over the place, all over the map. I remember, I think in my third or fourth year of grad school, I took in the same quarter an advanced CBT seminar and an object relations technique course at the same time, which, for some folks, that's sacrilege. You can't do that. I later took family systems. I tried to be a sponge. And all of the theories and approaches to psychotherapy fascinated me and continue to fascinate me, despite, in supervision, I think, having a heavier emphasis on psychoanalytic thinking. Later on in my advanced training, which was at a VA hospital, I really got a different glimpse of how CBT in practice could be helpful. And a lot of the demonized ideas I had picked up early on kind of, began to loosen. Because we did a lot of symptom-focused work. We taught coping skills in groups. We talked about the relationship between thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and educating veterans about that. And I saw how that could be beneficial in a different way for a lot of people. So I still and will always have a special place in my heart for a lot of the early voices within psychoanalysis, Carl Jung, Winnicott especially. I love those guys. But for some of my psychoanalyst friends, I sense at times that for some, not all, but for some, sometimes there's kind of a resentment, I don't know, a fear or a bitterness that there's been a loss of market share, if you will, and that evidence-based practices have become more trendy and are looked upon more favorably by insurance companies. And for some analysts, I think there's this feeling that, we invented the talking cure, and that everyone else came in and tried to make it boring and quick and simple, and they're providing services and getting paid or whatever. And I guess if that's the angle you're coming from, I can understand that. But so here's the other point I want to make. I like the debate. I think we need the debate. I think the debate is healthy. I think it keeps both sides of the aisle in check. I think, like all things, when we're able to introspect and reflect critically and be open to challenge from disparate points of view, I think that enriches the whole conversation and makes us better at what we do, regardless of what side, if we side one way or the other. So I hope it challenges and sharpens our whole field when psychoanalysts are introspective and critical of their own theories, and when there are studies conducted to show the efficacy of psychoanalytic therapy. I mean, there are some analysts who really poo-poo research and outcome studies, and you can do that all you want, but I think at some point we're sticking our head in the sand, and the reality is that people like numbers, and I want people to know that psychoanalysis can be effective. And on the other hand, I know there are some folks on the CBT side who don't truly appreciate the therapy relationship and how it can be such a prime context for bringing up and dealing with specific issues. And I absolutely agree that we're not computers, that we have complex pasts and histories which should not be ignored or minimized. So a lot of folks on the CBT side have much to learn from the richness of the psychoanalytic tradition and its rich writings on the therapy relationship. So I personally don't equate cognitive behavior therapy with manualized treatment, by the way. I understand the need for manuals from a research perspective, but and I think there are helpful things in workbooks and manuals, but in my experience and practice, we're complex beings, and I think there's certainly both art and science to drawing from the tools we have in our field and applying them at the right times in the right ways. But ultimately, I see it as a human, one-to-one human relationship. So I've definitely seen this debate get nasty and personal. I've seen mudslinging back and forth, and I'm not advocating for that. But and I've seen a lot of colleagues in the field sort of start really heavily on one side, maybe steeped in object relations or self-psychology or staunch behaviorists. I've seen a lot of people start on one side and come towards the middle over time. But then I've also known others who seem to become more extreme, more rigid, even militant about the one right way to do things, and the one right school of thought, or the one right way to think through the course of their careers, and that's more concerning. But I think, again, the discourse and the debate is useful. I think it's stimulating and ultimately benefits the work each of us does. I think it benefits our field as a whole, and hopefully, most importantly, the people that we serve. So give me an amen. Tell me if I'm out to lunch. This is my opinion, but it's just one, and I want to hear others. So I will step down now off the soapbox and let someone else talk. All right, calling in today to Psych Rally is a special friend of mine calling from a distant land. Her name is Lisa. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Martin.
Hello. We are friends. We've known each other for about, well, I thought it was 12 or 13 years. You said it was more like 16.
Right.
We knew each other through kind of the same circle of friends and church community. And one of the things that's interesting about sort of our friendship is that, we had some similar friends, but we didn't actually hang out that much, right? We didn't actually spend that much time together. And subsequently you moved out of the area, and we kept in touch mainly over the last, over decade through social media. But I think it's one of those modern miracles where, if you and I had been friends at another period of time, we might have just lost touch. But so I'm very grateful for other means that we've been able to stay in touch and now do this together on this podcast. So thank you for that. Another interesting thing for the audience to know about Lisa, this is on a personal note, is when I started dating my now wife at the time, Lisa was one of many friends who sort of knew my wife. And when I told Lisa that this is the girl that I was going to be, that I'd started dating, she was one among several people who said, "Ooh, good choice. Thumbs up." So, and 10 years later or so, we've been married. So thank you for that. That was a valuable confirmation to my life.
I do remember that conversation now.
Now you remember it. I see. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't you share a little bit about yourself, Lisa, so the people listening can get to know you, and then we'll go from there into kind of your experiences in therapy.
Well, I grew up in California in a middle-class family. My father has a master's degree from Virginia Tech. My mother has a bachelor's from a private Catholic college. And I remember when I was 3 years old that it was really difficult being 3 years old because I was always getting yelled at. And I made a promise to myself that I would never forget what it was like being 3 years old, so that one day I could help other 3-year-olds who were going through the same thing of just being yelled at or just doing something wrong. My vision during high school was to become a child psychologist, but
watch out for those psychologist types.
Yeah, but I ended up in engineering.
Okay. Maybe a better choice.
I think I was around 37 years old when I started therapy. And the reason I started therapy was because I was pretty depressed after breaking up with my first serious boyfriend. And I was feeling depressed, worthless, and not wanting to live. And a friend of mine from my congregation suggested that I go see the pastor at our congregation. He started to ask me questions about my family, and he said, and I was asking him, why is this relevant? He said, a lot of who we are is dependent on how we were raised. And I didn't think that made a difference or had anything to do with how I was living life as an adult.
You sort of thought they were two separate things.
Right.
Yeah.
It never occurred to me. And I didn't know why I was having depression or feelings of worthlessness and not feeling loved. And he said to me, you don't know how to pick a good husband because you don't have a good role model for marriage.
Ooh.
He asked me how my parents' marriage was. And I said, well, they sleep in separate rooms, but they're still living in the same house. Another one of my girlfriends had suggested that I go see her therapist named Leah.
Okay.
So I started seeing Leah, and she said, yeah, I can help you with attachment theory. And I didn't know.
When you say she could help you with attachment theory, how did you take that?
I didn't know what that was, so I had to read up on it, and I kind of looked it up online. And I figured out that I was anxious, preoccupied.
A certain kind of style of relating to other people.
Right.
Okay.
A lot of how your adult romantic relationships is dependent upon how securely or unsecurely you were attached to your mother as an infant.
So again, you're talking about that relationship between my early upbringing and my parental relationships with my relationships as an adult.
Right. And I realized I wasn't securely attached to my mother because she was inconsistent with me. And I saw Leah every week for 9 months.
Okay.
And yeah, during that time, she had me read books by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross called On Grief and Grieving.
All right, yes, right. 5 stages of grief.
Yeah, it really helped me a lot.
Great.
And she had me read Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman.
Right.
And she had me read Safe People by Cloud and Townsend.
Right. I'm big fans of theirs too.
Yeah.
Do you remember, was there something specific in those books that really spoke to you? Or one of those books in particular that just kind of had a big impact?
Well, Leah was working with me on how to build my emotional intelligence. And also, I knew in my head that God loved me, but I didn't feel it. And she said that the reason I couldn't feel God's love was because the grief was overwhelming everything.
That was sort of a block for you from experiencing something that you believe.
Right. Yeah, I knew God loved me, but I wasn't feeling God's love. I was feeling grief. So reading on grief and grieving really helped me through the grieving process.
Imagine that. I guess that's a well-titled book.
Right. And she also was working on helping me learn to listen to my gut and building my emotional intelligence. I started to realize, oh, that pastor was right. I don't know how to pick a good husband because I don't have a good role model for marriage. I kept dating players.
Sort of drawn to people who were not safe or not really people that were equipped to treat you well or the way that you wanted to be treated.
Right, or just players or liars.
Not long-term material.
Right, players trying to get into my pants, and when I'd say no, I would get dumped. Over the period of my life, after each breakup, or some guy that I broke up with, or some guy that I liked or dated and didn't work out, I would always end up feeling rejected and depressed afterwards.
And I imagine it's so disorienting because on one hand, you know that you weren't being treated well. At the same time, you feel rejected by this person who you don't necessarily think highly of. It must be very confusing.
Right. And during this time, Leah also worked on helping me to build ego strength and resilience and drawing boundaries and differentiating from my parents. I had told her that I hadn't cussed except for twice a year on Christmas and Thanksgiving.
Gotcha. There's a specific seasonal pattern to your foul language.
Yes.
Happens to recur around family reunion time.
Exactly.
What a coincidence.
And Leah asked, "Why do you have to go back?" And I replied, "You mean I have a choice?"
Didn't occur to you.
Right.
That maybe I can have some boundaries with my home environment too.
Right. I didn't know that was even an option until she had asked me. And so for 9 months, I saw her weekly. She was asking me questions, and I was processing my thoughts really slow. I would ruminate and feel depressed or anxious.
Would you say that being in therapy made the depression worse through that period?
Yeah, she didn't want to push me too far to send me over the edge, I guess, because she could tell that I was really depressed and suffering. And she would ask me questions, and she would say, "Did you just see what you did just now?" And I was like, "No, what?" And usually I'm a very direct and blunt person, and she would ask me a question, and she said that I was going around the answer, and I was not answering the question. and that I was even using humor to distract her so that she would forget that she had asked me that question.
Did she identify what particular kinds of questions or things that you were sort of diverting from?
I don't even remember what the question was, but she would just ask me a lot of questions, and she said that only someone with a high IQ could use humor to divert the person to be distracted and for trying to make them forget that they asked that question.
Well, I guess that's a compliment.
Yeah, I'm like, hey. And I didn't even realize that I was doing that. Like, it's like maybe my brain was trying to protect me from something that I didn't know about. And at that time, my health also just started to deteriorate. I had to go to the ER. I was having insomnia for like days, like 9 days of sleeping 2 to 3 hours a night. I don't know if that was the result of the pesticides that were sprayed in my bedroom, but I started to, I don't know. Yeah, pesticides were
a whole separate story. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there were other stuff going on too.
Yeah.
And I couldn't walk for 2.5 months. My body was so weak.
When you say, and I'm sorry, you just couldn't walk, meaning for an extended period or like in bouts of?
I couldn't walk for like 2.5 months. And if I did walk, my energy was about 1 hour a day.
And this all happened through the process of those first few months in therapy?
Yeah. Right before I started remembering memories that I had consciously chosen to forget for 16 years.
And you say you're starting to remember something.
Yeah.
Do you remember, was there a moment, did it happen in therapy or in between sessions where you started to get a picture of something?
Yeah, it happened in between one of my sessions, and I was in my bedroom, and it was like a shock. All the memories that I had forgotten came back to me after 16 years. I started to remember that I remembered the exact moment when I forgot.
Forgot about all these things that had happened growing up.
Right, I had blocked out those memories.
Were there specific images, memories, incidents?
Right.
Or just a general vibe?
No, just specific incidents from my childhood and from my parents.
Okay.
The pastor had preached 16 years ago. He had preached, God doesn't forget our sins. He chooses not to remember them. And so I just chose to forgive my parents and forget, literally.
Right, but it clearly wasn't a fully processed forgiveness.
Yeah, I made a decision to just forgive them, but I had never processed the grief. And what I found or learned from therapy is that as children, we don't have all the tools that we need to process trauma or grief. And so sometimes they just get swept under the rug until you're older, and then you can process it better.
Well, that's assuming as adults, hopefully we have the tools at a certain point as well.
Yeah, some adults never remember, but I was already an adult, like a full-grown adult, when I started blocking out the memories. So it wasn't like I didn't know that this had all happened. I was fully aware that everything had happened to me as a child.
Right. Yeah. But I guess the decision or the course that the memories took for you sort of prolonged and maybe even made it worse when they started to resurface the way that it affected you. You said, so you were remembering certain things, and earlier on you talked about your parents yelling a lot when you were 3. Is that the part that you started to remember? Or?
I started to remember all at once memories of me in 3rd grade where my dad slapped me because we had gone out on a family outing and I had procrastinated, and we came back from the outing and I told my dad, that I had a science fair project due the next day, and he slapped me. I remembered my parents physically wrestling with each other while I was in 3rd grade. my mother was cleaning the bathroom with a bottle of Clorox bleach in one hand, and my dad just went into the bathroom, and I was afraid that he was going to hurt her. So I remember walking over to the bathroom to make sure he didn't hurt her. And when I got to the bathroom, he had both of his arms grabbing her, or both of his hands grabbing her arms, and they were wrestling each other.
Ooh.
And I could tell that he was hurting her from how hard he was grabbing her.
Sure. Well, and they had already been in some sort of conflict?
I don't remember anything before that. I just remember the bathroom incidents.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as I got there, he kind of cooled down and walked out. And I remember my mom just like weeping on the floor and whimpering after he walked out.
Wow. And what did you do after that?
I don't remember doing anything after that. I think, I really don't have any memories of anything after that. It just, the memory ends there.
Okay.
I don't think I comforted her. I really don't remember.
Probably were feeling very overwhelmed and afraid yourself.
I don't even remember feeling that.
Don't even know. Yeah. Gosh.
Yeah. I mean, looking back, I think as a child, I don't think I felt afraid at that time. I just was thinking, I need to make sure my mom's okay, that my dad doesn't hurt her.
Right.
I also remembered in 6th grade that my mom was holding a knife towards my dad, and my dad was holding my baby brother as a shield against my mom, and my baby brother was crying and bawling.
Now, how old was he?
He had to be around one years old.
Gosh, he knew something wasn't right.
Right, and incidentally, that brother today has been on antidepressants for the last 13 years.
He's dealing with some of the after effects himself.
Yeah, he's been diagnosed with anxiety disorder, but I suspect he has PTSD as well. He just doesn't remember.
Were these incidents common, Lisa, in your household, or were these pretty isolated ones to what you recall?
These were isolated. This was not common.
Okay, for that level of
Right.
tension and aggression, that wasn't necessarily common, but there was certainly conflict.
Right. I mean, the yelling was definitely common, and the name calling, like my dad calling me bitch or slapping me, I can only remember him doing that maybe twice calling me a bitch my entire life, or slapping me twice in my entire life as well.
Yeah, but they certainly left an impression.
Yeah. It was pretty traumatizing that I started to remember everything all at once. And Leah, my therapist, said the analogy, for cancer, you don't give all the radiation treatment all in one day because it can kill you. You need to space it out over a period of time. And so she said the same thing with memories, that you need to let it out like a spigot or faucet slowly and gradually so that your brain can process the trauma.
That didn't happen for you, though.
No, I think I was so motivated and I really wanted to get better, and we weren't making any progress. I think everything just came back.
All in a flurry, in
Right.
very dramatic fashion.
And I remember, like, when the memories came, I had to ask myself, did that really happen?
Sure,
And-
it comes because you hadn't been thinking about it for how long?
Right. And I was like kind of confused at first, like, did that really happen? But the
Right.
more I thought about it, it became clear and more in focus. It's like a camera lens that gradually becomes more focused.
And what you're focusing on starts to become some scary images.
Right. And I was like, oh crap, shocked.
Well, and it's interesting is it sounds like what came into focus, well, at least what started to come into focus really quickly, was not just those specific memories, but also the memory of when you stopped remembering them.
Right.
In that sermon, right?
Right. Yeah.
So since both hearing that sermon and or after the realization of the impact of that sermon, how has that impacted your own sort of spiritual journey and your interaction with Christianity, going to church, those kinds of things?
I don't blame the pastor. I do blame my parents. And I don't blame God. I think he was just making an illustration, but I took it literally.
Sure.
So I literally had amnesia for 16 years.
Well, it makes me wonder if for people who are public speakers or preaching sermons, it's just, you don't always know who's out there listening, what are their experiences, and how they're interpreting what you're saying.
Right. I don't believe that was his intent.
Sure.
He was just trying to make an analogy like forgive and don't dwell and ruminate on how people have harmed you.
Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, it kind of landed in a different way for you.
Right.
Yeah. And yet, but fortunately later on, as you were saying it, you were able to kind of bring it back to the surface and look at it with fresh eyes and deal with it in a safer context.
Right. In therapy. And I didn't process all the memories all at once because it's too much for your brain to handle. I would just allow myself once a week or whenever my sessions were, and I would process the grief and the memories only during those 50 minutes. And at the end of each session, I was told, oh, you should go reward yourself because you did a lot of hard work. So maybe I went out and bought myself a smoothie or something.
Well, that is hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard work. So I didn't.
Hope you had a lot of smoothies.
Yeah, smoothies or moderate shopping, not anything excessive.
Tell us what getting better has looked like and how you see the therapy you were going through helping with that.
Well, the biggest improvement I've seen is physically, I don't have the tachycardia every day anymore.
That's a good thing.
And the frequency of waking up in the middle of the night with night sweats, tachycardia, and anxiety went from every day to 3 weeks, every 3 weeks at its best. I mean, I still get them now because I still have about a year's work of therapy left. With child abuse, it does take longer to clear out trauma.
Well, I assume it depends on each person, but yeah, if there's that's the estimate from your therapist that's about how much more work you want to be doing with her.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
that's where the disagreement came with my first EMDR therapist.
I see.
He was like, well, I've already cleared out the first and the worst occurrence. I'm done. And I'm like, no, you're not. I'm still having symptoms. I want a second opinion.
Well, and it's interesting to think of as trauma as something you just clear out. Right. That it's gone, almost like, as you said before, you forget about it. But I mean, you work at it, and obviously you've been processing it, and that's been helpful. But it'll always be part of your experience. And it sounds like this second therapist you're working with understands that much better. Yeah.
Right. And also with ADHD, the fixes don't generalize. And so you do need to process each and every occurrence from your childhood. So that's really been helping me a lot physically and mentally. My processing time is a lot faster. I don't tend to ruminate as much anymore, or my brain doesn't get stuck in a loop or broken record as much. It still happens, but it's not as bad as it used to be.
And you're walking, I assume.
Yeah, physically I'm doing much better. I had
Good.
3 root canals because I had fractured my teeth while I was sleeping.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I reversed the prediabetes. I've cut out gluten amongst other things.
So holistically, you've been on the mend for the last few years. Therapy sort of helped break some of these things open, has continued to move you forward on that recovery path.
Yeah, I mean,
Good.
it's directly proportional. Like, as my mind was getting better, my body was getting better too.
Well, it's all connected.
Right.
Right.
And I used to read the Bible every day, but I have rarely read the Bible the last 5 years. And the reason is because every time I would open up the Bible, I would just start to cry and grieve uncontrollably.
Wow.
And so it's like that spigot or that faucet. I try to control it so that I'm only grieving once a week or whatever in therapy for an hour. because if I were grieving every day like I used to, I would not be able to function.
I hope that there will be a time when you're able to nurture your spirituality and read the Bible as much as you like.
Yeah, so little by little, like as I'm getting better and as I'm clearing out more trauma and processing the grief, I'm able to read the Bible more and more frequently, but not to the frequency that I used to before this happened.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing. If there's one thing that you would like for listeners to this interview to take from this, what would that be?
If you have trauma or if you have even just struggled with depression or anxiety, I highly recommend therapy. I mean, it's helped me. I know it's expensive, but it's the best money I've spent ever. And I kind of look at it as, well, there's physical health, but mental health can be, or even more important than your physical health. But it's helped me in so many ways that I can function so much better. My brain's not stuck in a loop as much. I don't feel overwhelmed with depression or anxiety as much. It's still a long way to go, but I've improved in a lot of ways.
I'm glad to hear. Well, I obviously am very glad that you've had a positive experience in therapy, and it's really brought some important things to the surface for you to deal with and are in better health, of course.
Yeah.
And functioning better.
Yeah, less anxious, less depressed. I feel like I'm getting my life back before all of this happened.
Yeah. That's always delightful to hear, both as a friend and as a therapist.
Right.
So thank you so much for sharing personally, Lisa. You've obviously been on a long journey, and I hope people can get something of value from your experiences, and that wouldn't happen if you weren't able to be so vulnerable with us here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, that was Lisa talking about how therapy helped unearth some important memories that needed to be dealt with and reworked. Wow, there was a lot more to hear there, but I think what Lisa shared is a real reminder of how we are whole people, some things had really gotten pushed down for her, but they were screaming to come back up. And, hey, mind and body are connected. Psychologists and physicians, we are on the same team. And what doesn't get talked out often will show up in some other way or some other part of the body. And I'm just glad Lisa found the right help and seems to be on the mend on all fronts. And I ask you, what have you buried down? What lies beneath? What needs to be dealt with? Think about it. Talk about it in your own therapy. And then where do you stand on the debate in the field of psychotherapy? Are you an either or a both and kind of person? And if you've been in psychoanalysis or cognitive behavior therapy, what was your experience of that? Again, send me a tweet at Psych Rally or Facebook or email me. And as always, please subscribe to Psych Rally on iTunes and on the YouTube channel. I will see you next time when Kristen Fort and I are going to be discussing minority representation in the field of psychology, as well as ethnic and racial issues as they relate specifically to psychotherapy. So tune in for episode 6.